My name is Cullie Max Tarleton. I grew up in that era of double names, the Sarah James and the Betty Ruths and the Cullie Maxes, and my grandmother called me Cullie Max her entire life. But I was born in 1939 in Union County, North Carolina, on a small farm outside the little town of Marshville. My parents had a small farm there, and my mother was widowed when she was 34, and I was 9 years old. I was the second oldest, and so we made do farming that little farm.
And so you went to school in that county, right, and you were working on the farm because of your family situation. Talk about your interests when you started out in grade school. Did you have any interest in media? I mean, we were kind of on the cusp of television and radio and things. Those were fairly new.
I really didn't. We, of course, listened to the radio. This was before television. I remember when we got our first television. I think I was in the, 8th or 9th grade or something like that. But no, I never had any real interest in media. I had my favorite radio shows, the Lone Ranger and Tom Mix and those kinds of things. But no, I didn't, unlike a lot of people who make a career in broadcasting, I didn't grow up around a radio station and go over and offer to sweep floors if they'd let me hang around, that sort of thing. I always found it fascinating, the first radio station I ever visited. I think it was WMAP in Monroe. I had a friend who did Sunday afternoons there. His name was Bebop Bob. So Bebop and I were good friends, and he'd let me hang around the studio on Sunday afternoons while he did his show.
Wow. So in high school, what were your interests? What did you do?
I probably, in high school, wanted to be a farmer. I enjoyed it. That's all I knew. I mean, we had a cotton allotment. It was a very poor little farm. We raised wheat and oats and milked our own cows and slaughtered our own pigs and that sort of thing. But because of our circumstances, our economic circumstances, my teachers never encouraged me to go to college because they knew we couldn't afford it. Although I was a good student. I mean, I was a very good student in high school. But I got out of high school, and 10 days later I was in the Army, and got out of the Army and I went to work.
So when you got out of the Army, where did you go to work?
Went to work for a company called Miller Motor Express in Charlotte. A friend of mine was working there, and got a job, just a clerk's job, and stayed there several months, maybe a year or so, and then went to work at International Harvester. And it was at International Harvester that I first got sort of interested in sales. I got it put into a promotion marketing position and was sort of on the cusp of sales. And then went from that job to Sealtest ice cream, and was a salesman for Sealtest. Sold milk and ice cream, not on a route truck, but I was sort of an advanced salesman, and selling milk and ice cream. And that's when I first got into sales and realized, hello, there's an opportunity here in sales, and sort of went from there.
And how do you spell Sealtest ice cream? I'm not familiar with that.
You have never heard of Sealtest?
No, sir.
Sealtest?
I have not.
Oh my goodness. It was part of the Kraft Corporation.
Okay.
And I'm not even sure if Sealtest is still a viable label, but we manufactured a great product. And I left Sealtest and went to work for Lipton Tea Company. Lipton bought the Good Humor ice cream company out of New Jersey, and I became an advanced salesman. Charlotte was a test market for their ice cream bars and family take-home packs that we sold through supermarkets. And then we opened up metropolitan Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Philadelphia, Binghamton, Syracuse, New York City, that whole area. And once we got the distribution pattern established, those of us who were advanced salesmen got our sort of choice of which market we wanted to be the manager in. And I chose Washington, D.C., and here I was age 23, and I was the market manager for Good Humor Ice Cream in big old Washington, D.C.
Wow.
And learned an awful lot. I mean, it was the first time I was ever exposed to budgets and planning and things like that, and did that for a number of years. And it became apparent that my next move would take me to New Jersey, which was the home office. And frankly, Washington was about as far north as this southern boy wanted to go. So we were in Charlotte on vacation, and I learned about a job at WBTV, and went out on a Wednesday and applied for it. And on Friday, I was hired. On Saturday, we bought a house. On Sunday, we drove back to Washington. On Monday, I resigned my job, called a real estate company and listed my house and got them to agree that if they couldn't sell it within 2 weeks, they would buy the equity, and which they readily agreed to do, and arranged to move. And 2 weeks later, we were back in Charlotte.
My gosh, about what year was that?
It was 1965.
In 1965.
1965.
And what job did you have at BTV?
I was hired by Tom Cookley in WBTV Sales as the National Sales Coordinator. It was my job to work with local food brokers and big food distributors and coordinate the national advertising that was being placed for them to make sure that the national advertising that was being purchased was being maximized by them, helping them with point of sale material and things like that.
And you had a great background.
Yeah. Oh, I did. I mean, it's what I was doing. Yeah. And I think that's why Tom hired me. And I did that for maybe a year, and then a job became open in the sales department, and I was hired to do that, and did that until 1969. I went into the radio division, WBT Radio, as a local sales manager, and started that process on up through general manager, and before I went back to television as GM.
Wow. Well, that's quite a climb, and a very interesting story about the job and getting a house and changing and moving back. You didn't waste any time.
My wife's a retired school teacher, and she says that being a teacher is like being a preacher. It's a calling. I frankly think I was called to be in broadcasting. If one little thing had gone wrong in that 2-week time frame, the whole deal would have been nixed. But everything fell perfectly into place. Nothing happened to mess up the situation, and I think it was God's plan to put me in broadcasting.
Wow. So you transitioned. You were a national sales coordinator.
Right.
And because of your background with the food business and ice cream. And then you went into radio and then the television side. Talk a little bit about what you did when you worked on the TV side of sales. We sold television advertising. You were on the street.
We were on the street.
You had retail accounts.
And we had an account list, and we went out and presented our product to the public, and I had a fair amount of success as a television salesman, and I think that's why the general sales manager for radio tapped me to join him as local sales manager at BT Radio. And my friends thought, "You're leaving television for radio? Are you nuts?" And I said, "Wait a minute. I'm salesman in television, sales manager in radio, easy decision." So I joined WBT Radio as local sales manager and did that for, 3 or 4 years, and then became general sales manager, did that for several years, and then became general manager and did that all during the 70s. I was the general manager of WBT Radio.
Now let's talk about those stations. Let's talk about WBTV and WBT Radio. Those were powerhouses. 2
of the finest television and radio stations in the country.
Signal went forever.
The most respected, among the most, I'll say among the most respected call letters out there. WBT Radio, a 50,000 watt clear station, and from local sundown to local sunrise, our signal was in a north-south direction, and you could hear us from Newfoundland to Cuba.
Wow.
And of course, WBTV Television was the first television station in the Carolinas, and as a result of that, established early dominance, and for years sort of rode that crest. But two great stations. Charlie Crutchfield, who was our president, just did a magnificent job. He was my mentor. Made sure that that good things happened to me, but he also made sure that I delivered. But a wonderful, wonderful man.
And your parent ownership was Jefferson Pilot.
Jefferson Pilot.
Insurance.
Yeah. When I joined the stations, it was Jefferson Life that owned, and then Jefferson and Pilot, all owned by the same company, merged those two operations, and it became Jefferson Pilot Broadcasting, and was that way until they later, they called it a merger of equals with Lincoln Financial. It was not. Lincoln Financial bought them. And that was the end of Jefferson Pilot.
And the beginning of radio and television stations in that era, broadcast properties were a popular investment by insurance companies. They needed somewhere to put their cash.
Exactly. And a well-run, I used to tell people this all the time, a well-run and managed radio or television station is like printing money. They are very profitable, but they've got to be properly managed and properly programmed. And
that's why we saw Durham Life own TV stations and many other insurance entities across the country. Very common to have an insurance parent, as did with BTV. And BTV Radio and BT Radio and WBTV had an enormous talent pool.
We did, and a lot of those early radio guys made a good transition into television. People like, Clyde McLean, for instance, who went from radio into television and became Cloudy McLean, the weatherman. But Jim Patterson, who actually signed WBTV on, came from radio. Fred Kirby came from radio into television. Even Mr. Crutchfield was the announcer for the Briarhoppers, and then became general manager of the radio station, and then was general manager of the television station when he signed on.
And Cullie, for those that may not know, tell us who the Briarhoppers were.
The Briarhoppers were a group of, I start to say local, they weren't all local. And they weren't hillbilly, but they were country, western, hillbilly, bluegrass singers. I think the original Briarhoppers, there were 4 or 5 of them. And Whitey Hogan was one, Don White was one, Fred Kirby, briefly. He briefly was a Briarhopper. Interestingly, the Briarhoppers are still in existence. They're still a group that performs under the banner of the Briarhoppers.
But in that day, if you were a musical group and you had a radio show or a TV show, you were a big star. Oh
yeah, and a lot of radio stations like WBT had country and western. I mean, Hank Williams had a country and western radio show, during his period. But the Briarhoppers came on, as I recall, at 5 o'clock Monday through Friday. Their theme song was "Wait Till the Sun Shines, Nellie," and their sponsors were these, miracle. Weren't drugs, but these portions of things that were supposed to cure what ails you, and they were very successful. And then, of course, they did personal appearances. Traveled around and put on shows out in the community at high schools and places like that, and did very well. And Don White, his name was actually Don Whitesell, ended up being a neighbor of ours in Charlotte, and wonderful, wonderful man, one of the finest guitar players that I ever saw. He left the Briarhoppers and went to WLS in Chicago because they had a show called the Barn Dance.
Chicago Barn Dance, very famous. WLS Barn Dance.
And Don did that, and then went to Hollywood and did a couple of movies. It was just an amazing time.
It was an amazing time. So, what year did you become the general manager of WBTV?
Probably around 1980.
Okay. And at that time, you had some pretty famous names, I would say, working at the station. Let's talk about some of those. Lunas McLaurin was there?
Lunas was there. Lunas did a variety of things. A very, very talented person and one of my dear, dear friends. He did music. He was our go-to person for anything musical. Clyde McLean, who was our weatherman. Jim Patterson, as I mentioned earlier, who actually signed the station on, could do anything. It could absolutely do any role that you needed someone in. Jim would find a way to fill it. Fred Kirby was there. Fred had his show called the Little Rascals Club, and Big Bill Ward, and the list goes on and on and on. But we had a terrific talent pool there.
Now, Lunas, I believe I saw in one of your newsletters that was available that his title at one time was Special Projects Director, but actually he was quite a well-known songwriter.
He was. Lunas, again, was one of those guys that if you needed a special project done, he was the go-to guy. For instance, when I was managing BTV, we did a project called Water for Africa. And the idea was that we would raise money to buy well drilling outfits and ship them to Africa so we could drill wells and provide water for people. And Lunas, as my special projects guy, was the guy that we had running it. And he came up with a deal. This was back in the day of NCAB Bank, and we would put big 5-gallon buckets in all the bank branches for people to drop coins and dollars in as we raised money for Water for Africa. And Lunas was in my office one day, and he was not particularly pleased about something. And he said, I have received 5 standing ovations at Carnegie Hall. And what am I doing today? Emptying buckets from banks. And I said, but Lunas, just think about what we're doing, the good that we're doing. And he settled down, but he was a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful guy.
And I believe he wrote a very famous song, at least in the Carolinas, Carolina Moon.
Yeah, he wrote a song. Frank Sinatra recorded one of his songs. Mm-hmm. It was amazing to walk into Lunas's little area, his space, and he'd be on the phone, and he'd hang up, and I'd say, "Who was that?" And he said, "Tony Bennett." just.
And I believe he was originally from Aden, North Carolina.
Yeah. Went to East University.
East Carolina Teachers College at that time, now East Carolina University, and a Eastern North Carolina native that did well. And we'll talk a little bit more about him here in a little bit. But you had mentioned to me an interesting story about Charlton Heston when you were at the radio station.
Yeah. One morning, radio stations do a lot of movie business, and there was a movie guy in town, and he was coming to the station to make a small buy, and he had a personality with him. And I was going down the hall and looked in the lobby, and here he said, his first name was Jack, I don't recall his last name, and Charlton Heston. And so I walked over and said, good morning, Jack. And he said, let me introduce you to Charlton Heston. And I said, good morning, Mr. Heston. I said, do y'all need anything? And Mr. Heston said, I'd love a cup of coffee and access to a typewriter. And I said, well, we have both in my office. Come on. And I said, my secretary would be happy to type. He said, no, I just need access to a typewriter and a cup of coffee. So we went in the office, and I walked in and said to my secretary, Barbara, I said, Barbara, would you mind getting Mr. Heston a cup of coffee, and then he would like to use your typewriter? And she said, oh, Mr. Heston, I'll be happy to type whatever you want. He said, no, all I really need is the typewriter. So we got him a cup of coffee, and this was back in the day we had the old IBM something other.
Selectric.
Electric, thank you. That was
Selectric.
that's the name I was looking for.
Yeah.
And so he sat down at her desk and at her typewriter and with a piece of paper and did whatever he needed to do. But just a delightful person,
Those IBM Selectric typewriters were great boat anchors. They were huge, and they weighed a ton, but they did a wonderful job.
But word quickly trickled out through the building that Charlton Heston was in my office, and we just had a steady stream of people walking by to see him. But a delightful person.
Let's go back to WBTV. You also had a relationship and friendships with a very famous national television personality, Charles Kuralt.
Charles Kuralt and Lunas were very good friends, and of course Charlie, in his early days, actually worked some at the station and at BT Radio, and then because BTV was a CBS affiliate and Charles worked for CBS, we had that connection as well, and he and Lunas worked together on the I like calling North Carolina Home album, and Charles wrote all the words and Lunas did all the music, but Charles was around frequently, and he and Hugh Morton at Grandfather Mountain were also good friends, and Charles would come down and go up to Grandfather, and anytime he did, he would come by the station, so it was not unusual to see him in the station, and again, just a wonderful person, and a word wizard unlike anyone I have ever met in my life.
Let's talk about something you just mentioned, and that is the project I like calling North Carolina Home. That actually was something that came out of the North Carolina Association of Broadcasters.
Indeed it did.
Let's talk about the history of that, how you were involved, and how the whole thing came about.
Well, Jim Hefner was president of NCAB at the time, and he called me one day and he said, I want to take you and Sylvia to dinner. I'm gonna be in Charlotte. And I said, okay. I knew Jim through our association with NCAB and Carolina football and basketball and all that sort of thing. So Sylvia and I went to dinner with him, and he said, I have this idea that I want to do, and I want you to chair it. And he told me about it, and so I said, okay, we'll do that. And he had already made arrangements with Chuck Blower Productions to do the production on it, and the production was fabulous. I mean, this was back in the day when, Chuck Blower just was king of the hill in that area, and we did it, and it caught on, and we had every radio and television station in North Carolina running, I like calling North Carolina Home jingles and blurps and things, and we did a big thing over at the governor's mansion when during the Governor Hunt's first term, with the project, and even today, all these years later, I still hear that slogan kicked around. I like calling North Carolina Home. It was a great idea that Jim had, and I was pleased that he asked me to be a part of it.
And it exemplifies the public service interest of broadcasters. It was a public service campaign. It was a time when there was it was a tumultuous time in the United States, and Jim Hefner came up with an idea that he wanted to move forward, and you chaired the campaign to make North Carolinians feel good about living in North Carolina.
Exactly. And you mentioned the public service piece of it, and that's a part that I think we miss today in broadcasting. I know it was a pain back in the day to have to commit to a certain number and a certain amount of PSAs as part of your license renewal process, but it did serve the public's interest. And one of the things that Mr. Crutchfield always impressed upon us was just that, serving the public interest. And he made sure that, he didn't care how much time we took being involved in organizations in our community, so long as we got our job done and so long as we met our goals. But he expected us to be out there representing the station and doing what broadcasters were expected to do, to represent the public interest and to be involved in the community. And I think we miss that today.
And I Call North Carolina Home was a public service campaign that NCAB, the North Carolina Association of Broadcasters, in partnership with the state of North Carolina and through the generosity and partnership with Governor Jim Hunt, put some money behind and made it happen.
Yeah.
And then broadcasters gave hundreds of thousands of dollars of free airtime.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And still do.
Yeah, absolutely.
And still do.
Yeah.
And that's what made it work.
Yeah.
Let's talk about another thing about Charles Kuralt. You know, people in today's world are familiar with Charles Kuralt, who's passed on, but he did a very famous series with CBS called On the Road, where he traveled all over the country, and he was a great storyteller. You said he was a great wordsmith.
He was.
And through his friendship with Lunas and you and other people, you saw him frequently. In fact, in 1982, when they started kind of a summer to see if this really would work, the station was involved. Let's talk about that.
Okay. One of the things that that Charles On the Road series did, it also gave rise to a number of sort of, I call them Charlie wannabes at stations around the country. We had one we called Carolina Camera, and where we stayed pretty much in the area, within our viewing area, and did what Charlie did on a national level. You know, Charlie had the On the Road series, and of course he anchored CBS Sunday mornings for years and years and years. In fact, I told him one day, I said, "You are personally responsible for keeping more people away from church on Sunday morning than any person in the world, because if it's a choice between going to church or staying home and watching you on CBS Sunday morning, tough decision sometimes, tough decision." Yeah.
Well, when he decided to do his On the Road series, of course, he called his good friend Lunas McLaughlin, and who was at WBT, and Lunas wrote the music for that series. And some other people on your staff had some story ideas that he used as well.
I'm not surprised, and I never discussed that with Charles, but that doesn't surprise me. And again, Hugh Morton, who owned and was president of Grandfather Mountain, was also part of that process. In fact, Charles had a little special cabin that Hugh had for him at Grandfather Mountain, where he could just go and get away and trout fish, and I think at least one time he featured Grandfather Mountain in his On the Road series. But those were just wonderful stories. They were just stories about America and about people and about good things happening. And you know, when you run a television station, at least for me, the number one criticism I always got from people when I'd go out and do the Rotary clubs and those kinds of meetings was always, "Why don't you ever put on some good news?" Every newscast is fires and accidents and deaths and shootings, and I would say, look, we don't make this up. You know, until just recently, I had never heard the term fake news. Fake news didn't exist when I was running television stations. Everything we put on the air was true, and I said, plus, you don't want me censoring the news. You don't want me deciding which stories to tell you and which stories not to tell you. We're just going to tell you what happened. And as I used to have discussions with my anchors, I would say, what I'm looking for from my news anchor is, tell me what happened today. Pretend that we're out in the backyard and I'm in my yard and you're in your yard and we're sort of leaning on the fence, and I say to you, tell me what happened today. That's what I want our newscast to be about. Just tell me what happened. We don't have to interpret the news. We don't have to offer commentary. Just tell me what happened, and then I'll decide after I hear what happened.
It's a great approach. You know, you've told the story of how you went from working with companies and food involvement, and that kind of segued into being a national sales representative with the TV station and then the radio station. There were lots of opportunities, and one of the things that you had mentioned earlier when we were chatting was that TV stations were growth opportunities for people. They got in as floor directors on the morning news, and then they moved up. Talk a little bit about how all that worked and how that really became such a great opportunity for people to grow and move up in organizations.
Well, it's certainly not uncommon back in the day for people who started on what we call then the floor crew. They, set up the studio and pushed cameras and shot shows, and most of them were college educated, having come through the Chapel Hill program or the Appalachian program, and they would join us on the floor crew, and then they would go from there to a supervisory role, and then perhaps from there to a director's position, and then from there, some of them, if they wanted to, could move into other areas. Dick Taylor, for instance, who was was part of our talent pool at WBTV, was a member of our sales department for a while, and he had come from production. As I used to tell people when they would come and I'd have parents call me and say, "Would you talk to my child? They think they want to be in broadcast. Would you just talk with them?" I said, "Well, of course, I'd be happy to." And I would always say, if you know that's what you want to do, that's fine. Go to school, get yourself a good liberal arts education, and then take whatever job you are offered. You're not going to start up here. You're going to start down here, because down here is where you need to start, because this is where you learn and then you grow as you get up here. And we would put people on the floor crew, and they would go from there. And many of the people who became sales managers, supervisors, directors, producers, are people who started on the floor crew, because it's a wonderful place to learn the business, to learn every little piece of the business.
Well, WBTV and WBT Radio were shining stars in the country as far as the quality of what you all did under your leadership and others. I've heard Jim Goodman at Capital Broadcasting say when he took over that operation, what he did was he watched what WBTV did and tried to copy it so that they could be as successful at WRAL as you did. And he also tried to hire your people, and he did hire some of them.
He did. Let me tell you, if I were running a television station today, I would want to emulate what Jim Goodman does. I think Jim Goodman is the finest broadcaster in North Carolina. I have so much respect and admiration for him. He is willing to experiment with new ideas. He's always on the cutting edge of technology, and his heart is in the right place. And he does a wonderful job using the resources of that company for the good of the people of North Carolina.
I would agree. And the other thing that has been a great resource for broadcasters in North Carolina has been the North Carolina Association of Broadcasters. Sharing ideas, getting to know each other, and of course Capital Broadcasting and Jim Goodman were a big part of that. Jefferson Pilot with WBTV and others, and you have a number of accolades. You're a past president of NCAB. You received the Distinguished Service Award, many other honors. And let's talk a little bit about the association. That was really kind of a incubator.
It was and still is. Don Curtis, who is a dear friend of mine and a very successful broadcaster. Don had the good judgment to go the ownership route, which I didn't, and as a result, he's done a whole lot better than I did. But Don and I first became acquainted at NCAB. We used to do sales training seminars together for NCAB. Carl Venters I met through NCAB, although I remember when I was local sales manager for WBT Radio, Carl owned a radio station in Farmville, North Carolina, whose call letters, and I'll never forget this, were WFAG. And because cigarettes at that time were referred to as fags, and that was tobacco country. And I remember talking to Carl on the telephone, trying to sell him on Carey and Duke football, which we produced at WBT, and then later on met Carl through NCAB, and then later on he and I served together on the NAB radio board for a number of years.
And let's talk about that,
Okay.
because NAB is the National Association of Broadcasters, and not only were you involved at the highest levels of the state organization, North Carolina Association of Broadcasters, your leadership went further. You went to the national organizations. Tell us what you did there.
I spent 12 years on the board of NAB, radio and television, and enjoyed every moment of it. Was radio board chairman for a year, and of course vice chairman the year before that leading up to it, which allowed me to, I had the distinct honor of going to the White House and inducting President Reagan into the NAB Radio Hall of Fame.
Wow.
And because when we did that at our convention, it was right after he had been shot, and he was not able to be there, and so we went to the White House and did that. And also it was the same year that we had elected Kate Smith to the NAB Radio Hall of Fame. And turns out she was living here in Raleigh at the time. And Wally Owsley, who was with PTF, was a friend of her sister's, and Kate was living with her sister. And so he arranged for me to go to her sister's house and meet with Kate and induct her into the NAB Radio Hall of Fame. And it turned out to be on her birthday. And she said that the President Reagan, had just called her to wish her happy birthday. And I said, well, I was just at the White House inducting the president into the Hall of Fame as well. So you're in good company. But she was a delightful person.
She was. And Kate Smith, for people that may be watching this years later, was probably the most famous person that ever sang God Bless America.
That was her song. That was absolutely her song.
It was. And President Reagan, known as Dutch Reagan back then, had a number of prestigious broadcasting jobs, including being an announcer, a sports announcer, on another 50,000-watt clear channel station, WHO, in Des Moines area, which you could hear coast to coast as well at night after the sun went down. There were, what, 8 of those or 10 of the 50,000?
I don't remember. I'm a past president of the Clear Channel Association. I ought to know the number of them, but
not very many.
There aren't very many.
But when the sun went down, if you were within that, you could hear them.
And he told us a story one time about that period of his life, and when he was broadcasting baseball for the station, and he was not watching the game. He obviously was not at the stadium. At the end of each inning, the AP would send out a report as to what happened in that previous ending.
So the Associated Press is the AP for short, in case people don't know that, which was a news organization that sent a feed out on a teletype wire, and that's how stations at that time, before other types of communication, they were hooked in sometimes through a series of phone lines that were put together to have enough bandwidth, and this would come up at the end of each inning of the baseball game to give you a rundown so that radio announcers and television announcers could give updates.
And he said, I would take that, rip it and take it. And he said, then I would sit there and tell people what happened in that ending. And he said, radio is not a visual medium. It's an imaginary. You can imagine, and when you're on radio, you can say, I met this whatever, and the visual image you have is different from the visual image someone else might have. But anyway, he said, I created in the mind's eye exactly what happened in that ending. And he said, I would say things like, well, it's getting over in the afternoon and the shadows on the field are affecting it. He said, I'm not seeing anything, but he created that in the mind's eye. And he did that for years. There's a reason why they called him the great communicator. He understood the medium.
He really did. And the theater of the mind is a very, very powerful place when you have someone as skilled as Ronald Reagan doing the play-by-play, and later became president. And gosh, what a distinct honor to be able to induct him, and then Kate Smith after that. Wow.
It was fun.
Let's go back to WBTV. Let's talk about some of the things that you're the proudest of while you were the general manager there. Some of the accomplishments. You had a powerhouse station. You had some of the best people in the country on the air. They didn't want to go anywhere. They were living in Charlotte. Wonderful lifestyle, great station. Tell us some stories about that.
Gosh, I don't know that I have any real stories. We were blessed in that we had a fabulous staff, and you know, I tried to just be a good manager and a good leader and get out of the way then and let people do their job. And we didn't lose a lot of people. Occasionally we would, and I understand that. I used to, there's a television station in Roanoke, Virginia. The general manager used to just give me fits because if we had a vacancy, that's the first place I looked. And I said, well, you know, it's like the fish in the ocean. You know, the big fish eat the little fish, and you know, we hired from markets like Richmond and Roanoke and Columbia and places like that. And then when we lost people, we would lose them to Washington and Philadelphia and Baltimore and occasionally New York and Chicago. But we had wonderful people and wonderful staff, and we were very successful. We had good numbers, good ratings, both in radio and television, and so you use those ratings that because they translate, as you know, into dollars, and as a result, we were very successful, and for which I'm very grateful. I remember Sylvia and I were in Europe one time on the only 3-week vacation that we've ever taken in our life. And we were in Florence, Italy, and this was in the 70s, and the radio ratings had come out, and the general sales manager sent me a telegram, and he said, numbers are out, we're number one, all day part, stay another week.
Wow.
So it was a wonderful time, wonderful time.
That is. Well, you were at WBTV until 1990. Right. But your career didn't stop then. You are such an active fellow, and you continue to be active. What was the next chapter after that?
After WBTV, I joined Bahakel Communications and stayed there a number of years, and ran their Charlotte station, and then ran their television division, and then ran the cable, radio, and television, and then retired in 2001 and got involved in politics.
Oh my gosh. Well, and Bahakel was a logical transition for you because you were able to stay in Charlotte.
I stay in Charlotte,
yeah.
And that was great experience and a great opportunity, and exposed me to another different kind of broadcaster, because you know the Jefferson profile, the Jefferson format was a little different than most broadcasting companies. But the Bahakel family could not have been better or nicer to me. And Beverly Bahakel Poston, who is currently running the company, is just, I think, one of the nicest, sharpest people that I know. I'm very proud of what she has accomplished.
So from broadcasting to politics, how does that work?
Well, I had always had an interest in politics, and when I was working, Lord knows I gave enough money to politicians. But I always said that when I retire, I'm going to run for office.
Really?
And we had restored a home in Blowing Rock. We had restored an old home in Blowing Rock that we were using for vacations and weekends. And when we both retired, we moved there full time. And I promptly declared for office, which I think to this day people must be shaking their heads and saying, who did he think he was to come up here without any portfolio at all in local activity and expect us to support him? and I ran for the state house and came that close to winning. Didn't win that first time out. But I announced that same day that I'll run again in 2 years.
Really?
And I did, and spent the next 2 years just laying the groundwork, and was successful, and was successful in getting reelected again. And it was a privilege to serve in the North Carolina House. That's the only way I know to describe it. An absolute privilege. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Was able to get some good things accomplished for my district. I worked at it hard. I was retired so I could devote full time to it, and I worked at it full time. We even bought a condo here in Raleigh so we wouldn't have to worry about that. We'd just hop in the car and come up, and I was thoroughly enjoyed it. And the Speaker of the House, Joe Hackney, whose integrity extends from here to Montezuma and back, gave me some wonderful opportunities and made me chair of some important committees, which further helped me along. And as I say, it was a privilege, just a privilege.
But the story doesn't stop there.
No, and when I left the legislature, the Speaker appointed me to the North Carolina Lottery Commission, and I served there for a while. And
now that was the beginning of the lottery.
Yeah, well, it was not the very beginning,
but it was
very close to the beginning, and enjoyed that. And then Governor Cooper has appointed me to the DOT board, and that's what I'm currently doing, and thoroughly enjoying that. It's not unlike serving in the legislature. I mean, you have a constituency base out there. Biggest difference is in the legislature, my district was 2 counties. For DOT, my division is 8 counties. So I stay very busy. I tell people it keeps me off the street.
Well, being involved with the Department of Transportation at that level is a very important responsibility, and one that has more impact on more people, I think, than the general public realizes.
Yeah, I've always been someone who was willing to, my phone number's on my business card, my home number's on my business card. I expect to hear from constituents, and they don't disappoint me.
And it doesn't stop there. You've still kind of got your hand in the television industry. You're involved with public television.
I am. I always thought when I was in commercial television that I would like to end my career running a public television station. When we were in Charlotte, WTVI was our public station, and the general manager there was a good friend of mine, and he and I talked about it a lot. I'm a big supporter of public radio and public television. In fact, during the course of my career, I've had 2 opportunities to testify before the Congress, once in the House and once in the Senate. And my House testimony was in support of public radio and television, urging the Congress to continue to provide federal funding for NPR and PBS. And then on the Senate side, I testified once on campaign finances for broadcasters, campaign finance reform for broadcasters. And an interesting story there, Senator Inouye, the late senator from Hawaii, was the chairman of the Senate. And Senator McConnell was in the Senate, but he was not a member of that committee. But Senator Inouye, as courtesy, allowed Senator McConnell to question me. And he was not especially nice to me, nor was Senator Gore. Senator Gore was especially not nice to me, and he accused me and accused through me all broadcasters of being willing to play partisan politics with political dollars and giving political candidates choice commercial positions. And I said, Senator, do you seriously think for a moment that I would jeopardize a television station's license that is worth tens of millions of dollars for a $5,000 political spot? And he said, yeah. And I started to respond, and the guy from NAB who was with me put his hand on my shoulder and said, let it go. So I didn't respond. But I said to myself, Senator, someday I'm going to have an opportunity to get even with you. But later on, Sylvia and I actually had dinner with Senator Gore and Tipper one night, and he could not have been more charming. So.
Well, it works out.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, you have a lot of interest here in Raleigh with being involved with the DOT, also a trustee for UNC-TV.
And I enjoy that. We are so lucky in North Carolina that we have a wonderful public television station, and then access for people all across the state. And I enjoy that role. I'm sure the general manager there would probably prefer that I be a little less vocal than I am, but I don't hesitate to share my thoughts and ideas with him. But the Board of Trustees of UNC Television is an advisory board. We are not a policy board. The policy is in the hands of the Board of Governors and the president of the UNC system.
What's next for Cullie Tarleton?
Oh, good question. I suspect my family would say, why doesn't he retire and mean it? I don't know. Whatever, wherever the Lord leads me, I guess. I enjoy being involved. I enjoy the new knowledge that I pick up and learn. I enjoy meeting new people. For instance, the current board of the DOT is comprised of people that I have never met before. So that's now a whole new set of people that I can interact with and get to know. My wife is also heavily involved in things, and we enjoy it. We enjoy it.
That is terrific. We appreciate you speaking with us today. But tell us one last thing.
Yes, sir.
Any young person that thinks that they want to be in journalism and broadcasting in some way, shape, or form, what is your advice?
Well, I don't think my advice has really changed. One of the things that I also did when I first retired and moved to Blowing Rock full time is I taught at ASU in their communications department for 2 semesters, and did that until I got involved in politics, and the time constraints were just such that I had to give up the teaching. And as I said to my class at the beginning of each semester, I said, you will need to buy the textbook because we will be following the text. That everything we talk about will be in the context of the real world, because it's the real world where you have to make a living. And it's not all about academia, but it's about the real world. So my advice to young people would be to get a good education. And if you know you want to be in broadcasting, then major in communications and broadcasting. But if you don't know that for sure, get yourself a good liberal arts education. And then use your mama, your daddy, your grandma, your grandpa, your aunts and uncles, your neighbors, and everyone you know to help you get your foot in the door somewhere. I still today write letters on behalf of old colleagues and young people who want to get into broadcasting. It's a wonderful profession. It's a wonderful business. It's very rewarding and very fulfilling. Is it easy? No. Is it hard? No. But it's fulfilling. And if you do it and you do it well, that you can help make good things happen. And I think in the final analysis, I think we were put here on earth for a purpose. And I think our purpose is just to love and help each other. Just love and help each other. And I think if we do that, we will have fulfilled God's mission for us.
Well, I think that's great advice, and we certainly appreciate the time that you've taken to come and share this great wisdom and stories with us.
Well, I don't know about wisdom, but it's been my pleasure. So thank you.
Thanks, Colley.